Chapter 9. Probably I was the first man who ever lived to take a specific order for a new variety of plant or tree, and to deliver that order as definitely as a contractor, taking an ancient architect's blueprints, will deliver a skyscraper or a church, a cottage, or a mansion. A good many people have not understood this. I know that it is sometimes supposed that my experiments have been performed by following along favorable lines of development, more or less accidental or fortuitous, until, by chance and some skill in selection, I have produced a new variety of plum, or poppy, or gladiolus. On the contrary, while many such accidental developments have occurred and have been taken advantage of, most of my work has been toward a definite and exact result, and I have persisted in my pursuit of this fixed purpose until I have achieved it. I mention this here and want to go on to write specifically of methods and results, because in this work of plant development there lies before the young men of today a field of research and invention so important and so rich in possibilities that I can see no limits or boundaries to it. It is a field almost neglected, yet in it are found promises of a service to mankind compared with which mechanical invention and the discovery and exploitation of new manufacturing processes fade into shadows. What Edison and Ford and the Wright brothers and Alexander Bell and Marconi and his followers and all the other great geniuses of chemistry and mechanics have achieved for the world is to be equaled, if not surpassed, in time by the men who turn their attention to the plant world and there harness the unimaginable powers and direct the illimitable potentialities that exist and that not only need guiding or releasing to double the working capital of the world. I have said before that it was a well-meant but inaccurate thought that gave me the name of the plant wizard. I have a gift or special ability or what folks call a genius for selection, but there is nothing magical or mysterious about my methods, and what I learn to do others can learn to do, and what I have started others can finish, and what I have found out about the laws of nature in this connection can be applied by others and added to by others, if only they will awaken to the possibilities that exist. I studied nature. I codified her laws. I applied them to get practical and valuable results, and I think of myself not at all as a master whose work must die with him, but as a pioneer who has mapped out certain new roads and looked down into the promised land of plant development. From thousands of incidents, let me choose one to show how exact in practice, provided you have patience and industry and knowledge of your ground, can be the filling of orders in plant development. A Western canner, one of my best friends, is Mr. John H. Empson. He came to me one day a good many years ago and told me that there would be a great market for a small, sweet, succulent garden pea for canning. The canned French pea had long been a familiar commodity to grocers and consumers, but it was high in price, and Mr. Empson was convinced that an American product could be made that would equal it in every respect. "Do you think such a pea might be developed?" Mr. Empson asked. "Certainly," I said. "Will you order it from me?" He laughed. "I can tell you that if you happen to get such a pea, I can get growers to specialize it to great advantage. If I thought you could accept a definite order and deliver a definite product, I would be glad to place such an order. But that is impossible, of course." "Not at all," I said. "I know what you want, and I will deliver it to you inside of 8 years, perhaps less." I knew then, and Mr. Empson told me afterward, that he couldn't quite believe I was serious. But I was entirely serious, because I had given myself definite orders in hundreds of cases and delivered on practically all of them. Moreover, this garden pea order was comparatively simple. The French pea is actually a pea that is not allowed to come to full maturity, but that is picked by hand when the peas in the pod have reached their most perfect state as regards flavor and sweetness. You see, as in most vegetables, the sugar content in the pea begins, as the time of ripening passes, to turn into starch, in which form it is stored for use in feeding the life germ when the pea is planted and germinates. If you pick your pea before that turning point is reached, the pea is sweet and deliciously flavored, though not yet at its full size. My first problem was to develop a pea that would be well formed, firm, and of uniform size when it was still not entirely matured. And it was there that I started. I chose good, uniform peas for planting, and I planted a large field of them. By selection, I found individual plants with a tendency toward the sort of qualities I wanted. The chosen pods were carefully saved and replanted, and selection again made toward the ideal. Meantime, there was another vital requisite in these peas. It was all well enough for the French to pick their peas by hand for canning, because they could work cheaply and charge high prices. For California canners, it was necessary to have peas that would reach the desired size and have the desired qualities almost simultaneously over a whole field. In short, the peas must be so characterized that they could be harvested by machinery, perhaps in 1 or 2 days. This meant that I must also select and reselect to get uniformity of the ripening period. My process was simple enough, but it required the application of infinite pains and patience. For instance, as the plan progressed, I harvested my selected seed only after counting the separate pods on each vine and the separate peas in each pod, choosing between vines otherwise alike in product, according to quantity as well as the quality of the peas. The promise I had been made that I would make deliver within 8 years. As a matter of fact, California conditions enabled me to plant 2 generations each year, and in 6 generations, or at the end of 3 years, I sent for Mr. Empson and told him his pea was perfected. He was amazed and sincerely delighted. In the course of this work, we had become well acquainted and very friendly. I refused to let him pay me, of course, because of this friendship, and turned the pea seed stock over to him to use for his own purposes. The pea was called the Burbank Empson, and today it is one of the chief crops in a large community in this state. Here was a definite order, definitely fulfilled, 5 years earlier than had been promised. But it was not magical nor mysterious. It was simply an application of the laws of nature as expressed in plant life, but that run through all life. It is an excellent, though small, example of what I mean above when I say that this field of endeavor is wide open to young men and women, and that while the rewards may be meager because as yet there is no method by which the plant inventor is protected in the rights to his invention, will pay enormous returns in satisfaction and incalculable returns in the good of the race. There are four divisions into which this almost untouched work may be divided: improving the quality of fruits and vegetables and the beauty and fragrance of flowers. Second, adapting plants to new environments and increasing the range of climates, soil conditions, and so on, in which they will thrive and bear. Third, developing plants so that they will, because of characteristics and strengths impressed on their present heredities, waste less time and vital force, and therefore have more of both with which to increase their yields. And fourth, developing wild plants, now unknown or unused by man, into useful and valuable servants and friends. It requires but a moment's consideration to see how true this is. As I have previously pointed out, nearly everything we eat and wear, and a great deal of what we use in everyday life, comes to us primarily through the leaves of plants. The mineral world, important as it is to man, contributes less to his comfort and development than the animal and vegetable worlds. And of these, the former, if you trace back far enough, is dependent on the second. So that the principal source of man's wealth, health, pleasure, and happiness in the plant life of this planet. If that is true, it must be plain that in neglecting study and culture and invention and creation in this realm, we are defrauding ourselves of untold billions of wealth and untold measures of satisfaction, beauty, and utility. I have spent a lifetime scratching at the surface of this illimitable field. Out of more than 100,000 separate, costly, and often bold experiments, I have added more than I can count in numbers and more than I can estimate in value, new wealth, to the gardens, fields, and orchards of the world. This is not written boastfully, but in the hope of encouraging others to enter this poorly explored and sketchily mapped territory of applied science. If I could stir even half a dozen young men or women, for it is a field in which women could compete with an equal chance and equal credit and equal achievements with men, I would feel that I had done even more than I have thus far in actual creations and discoveries. The joy of the pathfinder and explorer is much more in seeing settled and cultivated in the wilderness. The joy of the pathfinder and explorer is much more in seeing settled and cultivated the wilderness he discovers than in the initial discovery itself. Of all my developments, probably the best known and the results of which are most widely distributed and capitalized on by growers is my development of the plum. And nothing could give a clearer idea of how all my work was done and how results were made possible than by telling you something of the history of my experiments with this fruit. There are many other trees and flowers in which I have met with greater difficulties, from which I have learned more, and which have given me greater personal satisfaction. But the widest application in practice has, thus far, been made of the large variety of plums I have produced. Let us go back to the beginning of this fruit tree, then, and trace the steps of the work, in order that you may understand what plant development means and how it is achieved. Almost anywhere in the United States, you can find, in wild, natural state, at least scattered members of the wild plum family of trees. We have no definite way of knowing where the plum originated, but probably it was in that interesting and ancient triangle roughly pointed by the Caspian and Mediterranean seas and the Persian Gulf, to which scientists traced many of our plants and animals, and somewhere near which, it is possible, the human race itself had its beginnings. The plum became widely scattered, though, and this is not surprising when you consider its beautiful color, its firm flesh, its unique flavor, even in the wild state, and its hardiness, both of seed and tree. It could stand transporting over greater distances than the peach, the cherry, the pear, for instance, and it had in it the power to vary, to adapt itself to new climates and soils. It was tempting to birds and animals and to man, and they carried it about, either merely for the sake of eating it, or for the sake, as in the case of ancient tribes, of planting it and cultivating it for use. Certainly, it is found pretty much all over the world, and though the records of diligent investigators fail to show that it was a familiar fruit in ancient times, it must have been one that barbarous peoples ate, since only they could have carried and dispersed its seeds so widely. And this is interesting and important because it shows that the vitality and adaptability of the plum make it available for development so that it can be raised, eventually, almost everywhere where any deciduous trees will live. On the other hand, the plum, forced through ages to protect its life germ in the seed from animals, developed a stone or pit that was large, very strong, and greatly exacting from the tree. I've said several times that the making of pit fiber and the nut or seed of any plant is the task that puts the heaviest load on the plant. It takes perhaps from 5 to 10 times as much strength and nourishment for a plum tree to make its pits and seeds as it does for it to spread new leaf or root growth or to develop its blossoms. Therefore, the plum had less strength to give to fruit, and the result was a tree with a small, acid fruit and a large, very strong pit about the seed. Perhaps it has not occurred to you that the building of railroads and the erection of drying plants and canneries made a new era in the race history of plants. But it is true. What we speak of as orchards, especially in large fruit-growing sections, are new developments that were brought into being by modern invention. The improvement of methods of transportation and the working out of plans for extensive drying and canning operations. Originally, all fruits were wild. There was a long, dark era in their race histories when they grew merely for the purpose of perpetuating themselves through blossoms to attract birds and insects, to help in the process of pollination, through fruits to tempt birds and animals to disseminate them widely, and through the protective pit and the fertile seed or kernel. The pulp or flesh of the fruit, originally designed only as advertising to attract customers who would help scatter the seed, fulfilled its purpose and did it in a very perfect and complete way, for eventually men began to value the fruits so much that they not only transported the seeds, but they planted them, tenderly cared for the young seedlings, pruned and cultivated the mature trees, and introduced a new era into the race history of fruits, the age of gardens. For a long, long time, considered from the viewpoint of human beings, fruit trees were made a part of every garden, so that the owner had fruit for himself and his family. The work would go around the neighborhood, too, that Ack or Boris or Amos had a new treat in his garden, and he would find plenty of local customers to help him eat plums or pomegranates or figs. But even if he went into business, he could not reach a market very far from home, because, in the first place, he had no means of rapid transportation, and, in the second, the fruit would not stand handling nor last long before it had to be eaten. The era of the fruit garden, where the consumption was purely home consumption, was the second in the race history of the fruit. It was discovered that certain fruits, notably figs and dates, could be dried, and in that condition carried over long distances and kept for months in good shape, and a certain amount of business was done in the dried fruit industry. But nothing to speak of, considered in a broad way, until, within my own time, the steam engine and the steel mill made possible the railroad. The third era in the history of the race of fruit trees of the world is the era of transportation and modern packing methods. It was in my time, too, it was not more than a few decades since, that consumers showed that they would pay high prices for fresh fruit, preferring it to canned goods or dried fruits. I saw that this would be true, but I was one of the first. In fact, for a time, I was the only man devoting study and experiment to the end that fruits might be developed that would stand transportation and arrive in the hands of distant consumers in attractive condition. It was here that I began my work with plums. I must recall to your minds what I have said previously about the two new ideas that went into my life work, The idea that a man could use nature's own processes in a wholesale and definitely planned way, and the idea that he could considerably speed up her processes. There is no clearer illustration of this than to compare the fashion by which nature worked before man entered into the field at all, and the methods he used and the results he got, even in the most slipshod and indefinite style, after he began to raise fruit. It took the wild plum uncounted thousands of years to develop into the small, sour, undesirable fruit we find in our own woods and canyons today. In 2 or 3 short centuries, with nothing more than the most casual knowledge or care, man made the plum edible, fairly sweet, and measurably juicy by untrained selection and by cultivation. But he did not work by wholesale, and he did not work with any definite purpose or any single-minded enthusiasm. I brought both to the task. At the time I came to California, there were 3 varieties of plums grown here, one of which was of very little use at all, and neither of the other 2 of which would stand shipping. About 1880, I was beginning to turn my thoughts more and more toward experiments wholly. The nursery business was growing and profitable, but it seemed to me most anybody could conduct a nursery, and it wasn't everybody who would, even if he could, carry on that extensive experiments in plant development that I was itching to get at. Of course, I would have to make my experiments pay, somehow, or I would soon be up a tree. The nursery business had shown me that fruits were going to be in great demand in California, and, casting about for one that needed attention and showed inherent possibilities, I lighted on the plum. At about this same time, with my mind alert to pick up any vibrations that keyed in with my slowly formulating plans, I was browsing in the mechanics library in San Francisco when I came across a book written by an American sailor about his wanderings in Japan, and in it there was a description of a blood-red plum found in the province of Satsuma. That sailorman was not a skilled writer, but he certainly must have been a good trencherman, because he described that plum so that it made your mouth water to read about it. As far as I was concerned, the red-fleshed plum of Satsuma was sold and the first payment down. I was going to have it for California. Of course, I had neither time nor money to go to Japan, but I knew of a bulb dealer, Isaac Bunting, an Englishman, in Yokohama, and when I was in shape to start the plum experiments, I sent to him and asked him to send me a dozen seedlings of Japanese plums. The first shipment arrived in the fall of 1884, but they were all dead. So, continuing some simple experiments I was performing with local plums, I wrote to Mr. Bunting again, and on December 20th, 1885, I received what was probably the most important single importation of fruit trees ever delivered in America. 12 sturdy, healthy Japanese plum seedlings, among them one of the variety my sailorman had described. The Japanese, an island people, closely hemmed in by their environment, you might say, and strongly impressed by it, impress on all their products their own tastes and likes. On the plum, as they raised it, were impressed bright color, succulence, prolific bearing, and a tree habit of sturdiness combined with that crude, irregular form which so appeals to the Japanese. Behind their plums was all the wild tree heredity running back through thousands of years, no doubt, and on that had been superimposed the other hereditary traits that had come to their plums through environment and their own selection. I do not think, in the sense in which I judge plant improvement, the Japanese went deliberately about this work of making the plum characteristically Japanese. They had the seedlings, and when a good one came along, they passed it around among the neighbors, and so it got a foothold. Repetition, repetition, repetition put the plum, the habits and characteristics the people preferred, so that it mirrors them in a way and is marked with their trademark, for me, as clearly as though it were stamped Made in Japan. And 2 points are interesting here. The individuals in the Caucasian race are made up of such a number of world races that we get a greater variety of tastes among them. Some like sweet fruit, some a sour, some a soft, mellow texture, some a crisp, firm one, and so on. Orientals are a less mixed race. Therefore, they have tastes in food and fruits more in common. The second point is that wherever you find cultivated leisure classes, you will find a varied and complex diet. Whereas a race largely made up of the peasant or lower class, with few nobles or higher class people for them to know about and study and imitate, will have generally a coarse, simple fare in fruits, for instance, located inside a narrow range of flavors, textures, and so on. The Japanese are, though, an aesthetic people, and this crops out in their fruit because all their fruits and their flowers are remarkable for beauty. The 12 seedlings Mr. Bunting had sent me went right to work, and from them I added considerably to my store of knowledge of the secrets of nature as regards variation in plants. I was fairly familiar with the tree habits of the Japanese plum, from reading and from pictures. It amazed me to see how my seedlings took hold and how quickly they showed that they were going to surpass anything ever known in the hereditary lines behind them. For form, sturdiness, rapidity of growth, bearing power, foliage, and general characteristics, they were astonishing. Here was something to be accounted for. Well, I accounted for it, and later experiments I made, and many made by eminent laboratory scientists among the same general line afterward, confirmed my findings. The facts were, first, that the enforced rest given the plants, as a result of being uprooted, carefully packed, and moved halfway around the globe, had enabled them to store up unusual strength, and second, that the change of climate had so benefited the seedlings that they improved as a child might that had been sent to California for its health. The plums caught right on and became Californiacs in a few weeks. You couldn't find anywhere a better advertisement for rest and a change of climate, not even in the Chamber of Commerce booklets. Here, then, is one of the processes by which variations in plants are started and, by repetition, become fixed in those plants until they separate them in habits, powers, and characteristics, so widely from their parents and brother and sister plants that they are practically a different species. It is the process of giving the individual plant a new and more favorable environment. For not only does this frequently suit the plant better and enable it to carry its ordinary, known powers to a higher level, but it brings to light and expresses in the individual latent or dormant hereditary possibilities that otherwise would have remained submerged and, in the end, entirely lost. It is an example of the law of use and disuse. The home environment does not call forth this latent characteristic, such as the big and rapid growth of the plum seedlings, but the new environment does, and the characteristic springs up from the tiny germ tendency, and use strengthens it, and repetition fixes it in the plant. And it increases in power generation after generation because it is used and called on and put to work. And it is not lying dormant and threatening, as it probably would in the end, to die out in the heredity from disuse. Those 12 plum seedlings from Japan were the foundation stones on which I built my plum experiments. 2 of them came out so well and were so great an improvement, not only on our home plums and on European varieties, but on the Japanese plums that were related to them, that I put them on the market in 1889, 4 years after they had landed at San Francisco. One of them, described in my yearbook as very large, conical, heart-shaped, red with white bloom, very good, was named the Burbank by Professor H.E. Van Diemen, pomologist of the United States Department of Agriculture. The second was a plum with red flesh, very juicy, firm, delicious in flavor, and delightful in aroma. It was the very fruit, greatly improved in its new environment and having developed in it all the possibilities latent in its ancestry, so long dormant there in Japan, which my sailorman had described in the book I had read almost 10 years before. It was a dream come true, and in harbor of the province whence it was derived, I called it the Satsuma.